There's a specific, deceptively simple response worth examining directly, one that consistently outperforms every more elaborate defense strategy most people instinctively reach for when facing false accusations. Today, we're tracing exactly what this response is, why it works considerably better than the detailed explanations and passionate defenses most people's instincts push them toward, and how to actually implement it in the disorienting moment these accusations typically arrive. Let's start with understanding why the instinctive responses. Detailed explanation, passionate defense. Providing evidence to disprove the specific claim, consistently fail against narcissistic false accusations specifically, it's because understanding this failure explains why the alternative we're tracing today proves so much more effective. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narrative combat functions as one of narcissistic psychology's core operational strategies. When you respond to a false accusation with detailed explanation, you're essentially accepting an invitation into exactly the kind of extended narrative combat his psychology is skilled at winning, providing him material to twist, reframe, and use as evidence of your defensiveness, regardless of how accurate or how justified your explanation genuinely is. The most effective response: calm, brief, factual correction delivered once without elaboration, followed by complete refusal to engage further regardless of what follows. Here's what this actually sounds like in practice, worth understanding through concrete example rather than abstract description. If accused of something false, "You were flirting with my coworker. You're the one who started this argument." The effective response sounds like, "That's not what happened." Full stop. No extended justification. No detailed account of what actually occurred. No emotional appeal for him to understand your genuine innocence. Simply, calmly the correction, offered once, followed by genuine, complete disengagement from whatever conversation attempts to follow. Here's why this specific brevity proves so much more effective than detailed explanation. It's connecting extensively to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how his defensive system requires material to work with. Remember what we established about how detailed explanations hand him exactly the content his psychology depends on for successful counterattack. Specific details to dispute, timeline inconsistencies to exploit, emotional intensity to reframe as evidence of your own instability. Brief, factual correction offers none of this. There's genuinely nothing extensive to argue against, no elaborate narrative to dismantle piece by piece, simply a clean, undeniable statement that either stands or doesn't, without the extended material his usual tactics depend on to successfully counter it. Here's the second crucial element: complete refusal to engage further, regardless of escalations. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic psychology typically responds when initial tactics fail to produce the expected reaction. Escalating intensities, increasingly elaborate variations on the same accusation, sometimes genuine anger at your refusal to engage in the extended combat he's expecting. This escalation, however uncomfortable to witness, actually confirms that your brief, minimal response is working exactly as intended. Remember what we've traced extensively throughout this entire series about how his tactics depend on producing engagement, and how escalation specifically indicates that his usual, more subtle approaches have already failed to produce the reaction he's seeking. Here's why this specific combination, brief correction plus complete refusal to elaborate further, proves so uniquely disorienting to narcissistic psychology, connecting to everything we've traced throughout our conversation about the specific sentence that reveals genuine self-trust. Both responses share the same underlying mechanism: they don't require his belief, his agreement, or his eventual understanding in order to feel complete from your side. You've stated the accurate truth once. Whether he chooses to believe it, argue against it, or construct an elaborate counter-narrative afterward, none of this requires your continued participation or continued defense. Let's trace what actually happens once this specific response is genuinely, consistently implemented, because understanding the predictable pattern that follows reveals why this approach ultimately proves so much more protective than the extended defense most people's instincts push them toward. Here's the first thing that typically happens, connecting extensively to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about narcissistic tactics depending on producing specific reactions. When brief, factual correction meets genuine refusal to elaborate further, his psychology typically escalates initially, attempting variations of the same accusation, sometimes with increased intensity, sometimes shifting toward related accusations designed to provoke exactly the extended defense your minimal response has denied him. This is worth understanding directly as confirmation that your approach is working, rather than evidence that you need to abandon it in favor of more extensive explanation. Here's the second thing that typically happens: connecting to something we traced extensively throughout our conversation about the 4 signs revealing genuine private guilt. If the false accusation stemmed from genuine projection, remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about the 10 things narcissists accuse you of that they're actually doing. Your refusal to engage in extended defense sometimes produces visible frustration that reveals more about his own psychological state than any counter-accusation ever could. Watch for whether his escalation contains increasingly specific details that seem to reveal more about his own actual behavior than about anything you've genuinely done. A pattern worth noting quietly rather than pointing out directly, since doing so would simply re-engage exactly the extended combat you're specifically avoiding. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about how to handle this response specifically in front of witnesses. Since false accusations often arrive precisely in social contexts designed to make your defense particularly difficult, remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about how audiences without accumulated context cannot accurately evaluate isolated confrontations. If false accusations arrive publicly, the same brief, factual correction applies, delivered with the same calm brevity, without launching into detailed explanation specifically for the audience's benefit. If witnesses genuinely require more context, provide this individually afterward, privately rather than attempting to win the immediate public moment through extended, real-time defense. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that addresses a specific, practical concern many people raise about this approach. What if the false accusation is genuinely serious enough that leaving it unaddressed feels dangerous, particularly in contexts involving mutual professional relationships, family systems, or circumstances where his narrative genuinely could produce lasting damage if left completely uncorrected beyond your single, brief statement? This deserves honest, direct examination. Remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about documentation serving your own protection independent of real-time confrontation. In genuinely serious circumstances, the appropriate response isn't extended, real-time defense during the accusation itself, but rather careful, contemporaneous documentation of what actually happened, potentially shared individually and calmly with specific people who genuinely need accurate information, delivered separately from the heated moment of initial accusation where extended defense typically backfires most severely. Here's the fifth thing worth understanding. It's one that addresses something important about your own internal experience while implementing this response, since brief, calm correction can feel genuinely difficult to sustain when the accusation itself produces real, legitimate disc. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about non-reactive empaths and the crucial distinction between suppressing genuine feeling and simply choosing when and how to express it. This response doesn't require you to feel nothing about being falsely accused. It requires only that whatever genuine distress you experience gets processed privately, or with people who've actually earned access to your vulnerability, rather than performed in real time for someone whose psychology would only use that visible distress as additional material to exploit. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why this specific response proves so much more sustainable over time than the extended defense most people initially attempt. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how exhausting prolonged narrative combat genuinely proves to sustain, particularly across repeated instances of false accusation over extended relationship duration. Brief, factual correction, followed by genuine disengagement, requires considerably less ongoing energy than extended, detailed defense, which means it remains genuinely sustainable across months or years of navigating this pattern, rather than producing the cumulative exhaustion that extended, repeated defensive combat inevitably generates. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, and it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving this conversation as simply a technique without addressing what genuinely matters most, how to actually sustain this response authentically over time, and why its effectiveness ultimately depends on something deeper than the specific words themselves. The first thing worth understanding clearly is something we've traced throughout dozens of previous conversations in this series, and it deserves specific emphasis here, given how much this response depends on it. This technique only works consistently when it's genuinely authentic rather than performed while secretly still hoping he'll eventually believe you. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about narcissists remaining remarkably skilled at detecting the underlying need hiding beneath even sophisticated strategic calm. If your brief, factual correction is delivered while you're internally still desperate for his acceptance of the truth, still hoping this specific response will finally, somehow, produce the vindication extended arguing never managed to achieve, This underlying need often leaks through regardless of how disciplined your surface response appears. It's undermining exactly the effectiveness this entire conversation has traced. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that offers a practical way to check whether you're genuinely embodying this response or simply performing its surface mechanics. Ask yourself honestly after delivering the brief correction. Do you find yourself replaying the conversation, wondering whether he eventually believed you, needing some confirmation that the truth landed somewhere? Or does the correction genuinely feel complete once delivered, regardless of whether he ever acknowledges its accuracy? If the honest answer involves ongoing need for his eventual belief, this suggests the underlying detachment this response ultimately depends on hasn't yet fully developed, which doesn't mean you can't use this technique while still developing that deeper foundations. But it does mean expecting complete effectiveness before that foundation exists may prove genuinely frustrating. Here's the third thing worth understanding. It's one that connects to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about rebuilding self-trust as the foundation underneath every other protective strategy this series has examined. This response works most powerfully once you've genuinely reached the point where your own accurate knowledge of what actually happened doesn't require his agreement in order to feel complete. Remember everything we've traced extensively throughout our conversation about the sentence that reveals genuine self-trust. That's not what happened. Delivered from this genuine, settled place, functions entirely differently than the same words delivered while still hoping to eventually win his belief. The words remain identical, but the underlying psychological state producing them differs completely, and this difference, subtle as it might seem, is precisely what determines whether the response genuinely disorients his usual tactics or simply becomes another variation of the extended combat you're attempting to avoid. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about applying this technique with appropriate flexibility rather than rigid, mechanical repetition regardless of context. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the danger of over-applying protective frameworks indiscriminately. This specific response works best against narcissistic false accusations specifically. The pattern we've traced extensively throughout this series involving projection, narrative combat, and extended manipulation. It's not meant to become your default response to every disagreement or every piece of feedback from every person in your life, including people who genuinely deserve extended, thoughtful engagement when they raise legitimate concerns. Reserve this specific, minimal approach for exactly the pattern this conversation has traced, false accusations specifically designed to destabilize you through narrative combat, rather than applying it reflexively to genuine, good faith communication from people who've actually earned your continued engagement. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. The most effective response to false accusations was never really about finding the perfect words, though the specific brevity and factual quality we've traced throughout today's conversation genuinely matters. It was always, fundamentally, about reaching the internal place where his belief, his acceptance of truth, his eventual acknowledgement simply stops being something you require in order to know what's real. Once you've genuinely reached this place, the specific response becomes almost effortless, because you're no longer performing calm while secretly needing something from him. You're simply, authentically stating what's true, and then returning your attention to your own life, precisely because that life has already genuinely become considerably more important to you than winning any specific argument he's hoping to draw you into. This is what makes this response the most effective available, not because it contains some clever, strategic trick that outmaneuvers his tactics through superior technique, but because it represents the natural, external expression of an internal state this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations as the actual foundation of genuine protection. The words matter. The brevity matters. The refusal to elaborate matters. But underneath all of it, what actually protects you is the same thing this entire series has consistently pointed toward: your own genuineness. Complete freedom from needing his belief in order to know exactly what's true, exactly what happened, and exactly who you actually are, regardless of whatever story he continues attempting to construct instead. There's one more dimension worth adding here, because it addresses something practical worth carrying forward. What happens when this response is genuinely, authentically implemented, but the false accusation involves something with real external consequence? A shared custody arrangement, a professional reputation, a legal matter where his narrative genuinely could produce lasting practical harm beyond simply your own emotional well-being. This deserves honest, direct examination, because the elegant simplicity of brief correction then disengage requires meaningful adjustment when genuine external stakes exist. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about documentation serving purposes considerably beyond your own internal clarity. In circumstances carrying genuine external consequence, the brief, factual correction still applies in the moment of the accusation itself. You still don't engage in extended, real-time combat, still don't hand him the elaborate material his tactics depend on. So what changes is what happens afterward, privately, away from the heated moment. This is where thorough documentation, potentially consultation with an attorney if legal matters are genuinely involved, and calm, individual conversations with specifically relevant parties. A mutual employer, a family court evaluator, whoever genuinely needs accurate information, become essential additions to the briefs. In the moment response we've traced throughout this entire conversation, here's something worth understanding about how to distinguish which category any given false accusation actually falls into, since this distinction determines how much additional, careful follow-up genuinely warrants your attention beyond the brief correction itself. Ask yourself honestly, does this accusation, if left unaddressed beyond my brief statement, carry genuine risk to something concrete, my job, my custody arrangements, my legal standing, or does it carry risk primarily to my own emotional experience of being misunderstood or disbelieved by him specifically? The first category genuinely warrants the additional, careful, documented follow-up we've just traced. The second category, however uncomfortable, typically doesn't require anything beyond the brief correction and genuine disengagement this entire conversation has established as most effective. Here's a related consideration worth understanding. It's one that addresses something important about mutual connections who might witness or hear about false accusations repeatedly over time. Remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about why public unmasking typically backfires. If false accusations become a genuinely repeated pattern that mutual connections witness or hear about consistently, resist the urge to correct each individual instance extensively for their benefit. Instead, trust the same principle we traced extensively in that earlier conversation. Accurate patterns observed consistently over time by people paying genuine attention tend to reveal themselves considerably more reliably than any single, forceful correction ever could, regardless of how justified that correction might feel in any specific moment. Here's a final consideration worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation. One that addresses something important about your own relationship with truth itself, distinct from any specific technique for defending it. The most effective response to false accusations was never really a technique to master through practice, though practice genuinely helps. It was always, fundamentally, a reflection of something considerably more foundational: your own unshakable relationship with what actually happened, held so completely and so genuinely that no accusation, however confident or however repeated, can genuinely threaten it. This is worth carrying forward as the deepest truth available from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation. You already know what happened. You already know the truth of your own actions, your own intentions, your own genuine character. His accusations, however forcefully delivered, however repeated, however cleverly constructed, cannot actually change any of this. They can only at most produce temporary discomfort, temporary frustration at not being believed by someone whose belief was never actually reliable or trustworthy to begin with. Once you genuinely internalize this, that his belief was never actually the thing determining what's true, the brief correction we've traced throughout today's conversation stops feeling like a technique you're deploying strategically and starts feeling like simply, naturally, what an unshakable relationship with your own truth produces automatically, without requiring conscious effort to sustain. That's the actual destination this entire conversation has been pointing toward. It's not better technique for defending yourself against false accusations, but a self so genuinely, completely secure in its own truth that defending it, in the elaborate sense most people initially attempt, simply stops being necessary at all.